In August of 1969, a woman named Rosemary LaBianca was stabbed to death in her Los Angeles home by followers of Charles Manson. She was 38 years old. In July of 2020, Rosemary's granddaughter, a woman named Ariana Woke, was stabbed to death in her Denver apartment by a man she had met on the street only hours before. She was 40 years old. Two women, 5 decades apart, the same family, the same violent end. And between those two deaths, between 1969 and 2020, a family that had already survived something unimaginable was asked to survive it again. This is the story of Ariana Woke. But to understand it completely, to understand the full weight of what was taken from her family on the night of July 3rd, 2020, we have to go back. All the way back to a house on Waverly Drive in Los Angeles on a summer night in 1969, when the world learned the name Charles Manson, and nothing was ever quite the same again. Stay with me, because this one goes deeper than most. On the night of August 9th, 1969, Charles Manson sent 7 of his followers to a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles with instructions that were as simple as they were monstrous: kill everyone inside. The victims that night were actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and 4 of her companions. The killings were so brutal, so frenzied, so devoid of apparent motive that the city of Los Angeles went into a state of collective terror that it would not fully recover from for years. But Manson was not satisfied. He was reportedly unhappy with how the Tate murders had gone down. Too much panic, he said. Insufficient weapons. Too chaotic. The following night, August 10th, 1969, he took 4 of the killers from the previous night, plus 2 additional followers, and went looking for another house, another family, another opportunity to do what he believed he was orchestrating, a race war that he called helter-skelter, a term he had taken from a Beatles song and twisted into something unrecognizable. For reasons that historians and criminologists have debated for decades, he chose the home of Lino LaBianca. Lino was a wealthy grocery store executive. He and his wife Rosemary lived in a comfortable house on Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. They had spent the previous day at Lake Isabella with family and had arrived home late that evening. They had no reason to believe they were in danger. They had no connection to the Manson family. They were simply in a house that Charles Manson decided to point at. What happened inside that house on the night of August 10th, 1969, is documented in crime scene reports that remain among the most disturbing in American criminal history. Lino LaBianca was found in the living room. Rosemary was found in the bedroom. Each had been stabbed dozens of times. The word war had been carved on Lino's abdomen. The words death to pigs and rise were written on the walls in blood. Helter-skelter was written on the refrigerator door. Rosemary LaBianca was 38 years old when she died. She had a daughter named Susan. Susan was not home that night. She was the one who discovered her mother and stepfather the following morning. She was a young woman who walked into that house and found what the Manson family had left behind, and who spent the rest of her life carrying that discovery with her the way that only people who have found something like that can understand. Susan survived. She rebuilt. She had a daughter of her own. That daughter was Ariana. Ariana Woke was born in 1979, 10 years after the killings, in the decade that the wounds were beginning to scar over but never fully heal. She grew up knowing what had happened to her grandmother. She grew up with that knowledge as part of the fabric of her identity in the way that children of survivors always do, not as a story from a history book, but as something that lived in her mother's eyes, in the things her mother sometimes could not talk about, in the particular weight that certain anniversaries carried in their household. She was 40 years old on July 3rd, 2020, just 2 years older than Rosemary had been on the night she died. Before we go any further into what happened on that July night in Denver, and we will get to all of it, including a confession that one of the detectives described as one of the most disturbing things he had heard in 23 years of law enforcement. I need you to know who Ariana actually was. Because the generational tragedy of this case, the Manson connection, the parallel deaths, the 50 years between one stabbing and another, is so striking that it is easy for Ariana herself to become a footnote in her own story, a data point in a family history, rather than a fully realized human being with a life and a son and a laugh and a particular way of moving through the world. She deserves better than that. Ariana lived in Denver, Colorado, in an apartment on North Oneida Street that she had moved into only a short time before her death. She was a single mother. Her son, a young boy who was with other family members on the night she died, was the center of her world in the specific way that children become the centers of their parents' worlds when those parents are doing the work of raising them alone. Every decision Ariana made was made in the context of that boy. Every morning she woke up and organized her day around him. People who knew Ariana described her the same way, independently, without prompting: sweet, generous, silly in the best possible sense, the kind of person whose humor was warm and inclusive rather than sharp or exclusive, a loving mother, a good friend, someone whose door was always open and whose instinct when she encountered a person in need was to help rather than to look away. That last quality, that radical openness, that reflexive generosity toward people who had less than she did, is one of the things that makes Ariana's story so devastating, because it was not a character flaw. It was one of her finest qualities. The fact that it was exploited by someone she had known for only a few hours does not change what it was. It was goodness, and it should be named as such. Ariana had been struggling with alcohol addiction in the period leading up to her death. A friend had been staying with her temporarily to help support her sobriety, to be a presence in the apartment, a person to call on difficult days, someone who understood the specific loneliness of fighting that particular battle. She was fighting it. She was not winning every day, but she was fighting it, and the people who loved her were fighting alongside her. She had an on-again, off-again boyfriend named Patrick. He had moved out of the apartment a few months before her death. Their relationship had a history that included domestic violence, serious enough that Patrick was on pre-trial release from an incident between the two of them in May of that year. He was living out of his car. They still had contact. They had plans to see each other on July 3rd. Ariana Woke was 40 years old, and she was in the middle of her life, not at the end of it. She was navigating addiction and a complicated relationship and single parenthood, and all of the ordinary difficulty that those things involve. She was doing what people do when their lives are complicated. She was getting through it. She was making plans. She was asking friends to come to a barbecue. She was sending her son off with family and thinking about the afternoon ahead. She had no idea that the afternoon ahead had already been shaped by a decision she had not yet made, a decision she would make at a Walgreens on East Colfax Avenue when she encountered a 24-year-old man she had never seen before and invited him to walk with her. If you are finding this case for the first time through this video, and something about it is already pulling at you the way it pulled at me when I first opened the case file, go ahead and hit subscribe. This channel covers cases like this one every week, with the same depth and the same commitment to making sure these names are spoken carefully. Now let's keep going, because what happened next is where this case becomes something I genuinely could not stop thinking about. On the afternoon of July 3, 2020, Ariana Woke was walking from her apartment on Oneida Street toward the Walgreens on East Colfax Avenue. She had her friend's small dog with her. At the Walgreens, she ran into Patrick. Their meeting was not planned, or at least not planned in the way that a scheduled appointment is planned. He was there, she was there, they spoke. But something was wrong. Ariana had been drinking, and Patrick could see it.
She was too intoxicated to continue with whatever plans they had made for the day, he said. He left. What happened at that Walgreens in the minutes between Patrick leaving and Ariana heading back toward Oneida Street is the pivot point of this entire case. She met a man. He was young, 20 years old, she told Patrick when she called him later, white, dark hair, stylish in a way that she noted to Patrick in the specific casual way that people describe someone they had just encountered and found interesting. He was carrying a clear plastic Starbucks cup filled with a pink drink. His name was Jose Sandoval Romero. He was 24 years old, though Ariana believed him to be younger. He had short, dark brown hair and a distinctive red tattoo on his left forearm. He was wearing all black with bright red shoes. Jose would later tell detectives his version of how their meeting began, that he encountered Ariana arguing with Patrick outside the Walgreens, that she approached him, that she said strange things about frog poison and drugs that frightened him, that he did not want to go with her, that he felt compelled to help her home because she kept stumbling and falling and made him feel guilty every time he tried to leave. Surveillance footage from a camera on East Colfax Avenue captured them together at 5:15 p.m., Ariana and Jose walking eastbound toward Oneida Street, the small dog trotting alongside them. Jose is wearing all black. The red shoes are visible. They cross the street together and continue in the direction of Ariana's apartment. Inside a store on Colfax equipped with internal cameras, still images captured Jose clearly, the Starbucks cup in his hand, the tattoo on his forearm visible in the frame. Those images and that cup would become the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation into Ariana's murder. But that is getting ahead of the story.
A grounded investigative narrator, the tone is somber and respectful, leaning into the gravity of the subject matter. It should sound like a seasoned documentary filmmaker, objective but with a hint of underlying indignation during the systemic failure sections. It should be speaking at approximately 120 to 130 words per minute. At approximately 8:45 p.m., 3.5 hours after they were captured on Colfax Avenue, the downstairs neighbor in Ariana's building heard a knock at her door. It was Jose. He told her that Ariana was acting strangely, that something was wrong with her, that she was going to do something to herself. He said he did not like the way she was acting and he was leaving. The neighbor told him she would not come upstairs, but that she could call the police. He went back upstairs. 30 minutes later, the neighbor looked out her back window because her dog was in the yard. The man was in the backyard. He was shirtless. 15 minutes after that, at approximately 9:15 p.m., Ariana's friend, who had been away from the apartment for the day, returned and found the back door open. They walked inside, they called out, they walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. They found Ariana on the bedroom floor near the closet. She had been stabbed nearly 20 times. Many of the wounds were to her back and neck. She was pronounced dead by paramedics upon arrival. The man who had knocked on the downstairs neighbor's door to say he was leaving was gone. His Starbucks cup was on the front lawn. Detectives arrived at the scene on Oneida Street and found what the responding officers had already begun to document, a trail of blood beginning in the bedroom, moving through the living room and leading into the kitchen, a folding knife with blood on it in the kitchen sink, residue on the faucet. The obvious suspect, to anyone who knew even the basic facts of Ariana's life, was Patrick, the on-again, off-again boyfriend, the history of domestic violence, the pre-trial release, the plans they had for the day that had fallen apart at the Walgreens. Patrick came in voluntarily the following day and sat down with detectives. He told them about seeing Ariana at the Walgreens, about her being too intoxicated to continue with their plans, about leaving. He described the young man she had been with, dark hair, white, wearing a red shirt, someone she had apparently just met on the street while walking to the store. Then the detective asked him to put his hands out. Patrick's hands were clean. No cuts, no scratches, no marks consistent with a struggle. More importantly, Patrick had been wearing an ankle monitor as a condition of his pre-trial release. Pre-trial services had tracked his GPS throughout the entire day of July 3rd. He was not at Ariana's address at any point. He was eliminated as a suspect before he left the building, which meant the young man from the Walgreens, the one with the dark hair and the red shoes and the Starbucks cup, was not a witness. He was the only person who needed to be found. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from every camera they could access in the area around Oneida Street and Colfax Avenue. The footage from East Colfax was clear enough to establish what Jose looked like, what he was wearing, what he was carrying. The store footage gave them the tattoo. Multiple neighbors confirmed seeing a man matching his description with Ariana that afternoon. And then an officer noticed the Starbucks cup on the front lawn of Ariana's building. That cup, a clear plastic cup with a pink drink, the kind that is produced in enormous quantities by a chain that serves millions of customers every day, was recovered and sent for fingerprint testing. The prints came back to a name: Jose Sandoval Romero, 24 years old, matching build, short dark brown hair, red tattoo on the left forearm consistent with the footage. On July 7th, 4 days after Ariana's murder, Jose was brought into the station. This is where I need you to pay close attention, because what happened in that interrogation room over the next several hours is one of the most extraordinary pieces of confession testimony in any case I have covered on this channel. Jose Sandoval Romero sat across from two detectives wearing sunglasses. He said he was sensitive to light. He kept the glasses on for most of the interview. And he talked, at length, in circles, in contradictions that folded back on themselves and then unfolded into new contradictions. He told the detectives how he met Ariana outside the Walgreens, how she was arguing with her boyfriend, how she approached him, how she said strange things, that she put frog poison in her body, that she wanted him to do the same, how he did not want to go with her, but felt compelled by her stumbling, her crying, her apparent helplessness. He described helping her home, making her tea, making her coffee, trying to take care of her because she seemed unwell. And then, and this is the moment in the transcript that made me sit back from my screen, he said, almost conversationally, almost as though he was describing something that had simply happened rather than something he had done, and she would just keep crying and keep trying to fight with me, and at some point, she just started actually trying to fight with me. And after that, I just kind of lost it. He paused. And you know, in there, it's kind of just self-said. The detective asked him to continue. Jose Sandoval Romero told them that he had stabbed Ariana Woke multiple times in the back while she was walking toward her closet, facing away from him, moving away from him. He had met her approximately 4 hours earlier. But the explanation, if it can be called that, did not stop there, because Jose had multiple explanations running simultaneously in that interrogation room, each one contradicting the others, each one reaching for a frame that might make what he had done make sense. He said it was self-defense, that Ariana had come at him with a knife first, that he took it from her and used it. He said it was mercy, that she was suffering, that she wanted to die, that in a matter of only a few hours they had reached some kind of agreement about it together, and that killing her was the only way he could think of to help her. He said she talked him into it, that she played him, that she manipulated him into staying, into caring, into being in that apartment when he did not want to be there, that she had somehow convinced him, a 24-year-old man who had known her for 4 hours, that murdering her was the logical conclusion of their afternoon together. She talked me into it, and I listened, he said. That's it. The detective looked at him. Nobody can get talked into killing somebody. Jose's response was almost plaintive. You guys will never believe it, because how could you guys believe it? Because I can't get talked into killing somebody.
And then the detective said the sentence that I think is the most clarifying moment in the entire interrogation. What happened here is you stabbed this poor drunk lady about 20 times. Jose looked up. She wasn't drunk. Not, I didn't do it. Not, I want a lawyer. Not, I don't know what you're talking about. She wasn't drunk. As though the most important thing to correct in that sentence was not that he had stabbed her, not that he had done it 20 times, but that the detective had called her drunk. In 23 years of law enforcement, the lead detective said, this was one of the worst stabbings he had ever seen. Jose Sandoval Romero had been smart enough to flee the scene, smart enough to strip off every item he was wearing and dispose of them in a dumpster as he left, smart enough to spend the next several days at his mother's house watching the door, smart enough to evade investigators long enough to put distance between himself and Oneida Street. But the Starbucks cup on the front lawn of Ariana's building was smarter than he was. This is a good moment to pause and say, if this case is hitting you the way it hit me, and something about Ariana's story feels like it deserves to be heard by more people, subscribe to this channel. Every week we cover cases like this one with this same level of depth and care. The bell notification means you will never miss one. Now let's talk about what happened after Jose Sandoval Romero ran out of places to hide.
Jose Sandoval Romero's hands told investigators something the moment he sat down across from them. 2 cuts, partially healed, on his right hand. The specific kind of cuts that happen when a knife slips during a stabbing motion, when the fingers slide forward onto the blade during the force of an attack. Forensic terminology calls them defensive wounds on a perpetrator. They are the physical evidence that a person was holding a knife and using it with enough force that the blade came back on them. Those cuts were also consistent with the blood droplets found on the living room and kitchen floors at Ariana's apartment, droplets that had not come from Ariana, but from the person who had been stabbing her. His blood in her apartment, his fingerprints on the cup on the lawn, his image on multiple surveillance cameras, his description confirmed by multiple witnesses, and then his confession. Following the interrogation, Jose Sandoval Romero pleaded guilty to the murder of Ariana Woke. In early 2023, nearly 3 years after that July night in Denver, he was sentenced to 48 years in prison. His earliest possible release date is July 2055. He will be in his mid-80s if he lives long enough to see it. The detective who sat across from him in that interrogation room, the one who had spent 23 years in law enforcement and called what was done to Ariana one of the worst stabbings he had ever seen, had the last word in that room. You decided to stab her. Jose's final answer was not a denial. Well, she talked me into it. Ariana's mother, Susan, was 72 years old when her daughter was murdered. Let that number sit for a moment. 72 years old. She had been a young woman when she walked into a house on Waverly Drive in Los Angeles and found what Charles Manson's followers had left behind. She had spent the decades between 1969 and 2020 living with that discovery, raising a daughter, building a life, doing what survivors do, which is continuing to exist in the world even when existence is complicated by what you have seen. And then, in 2020, she received the news that her daughter, Ariana, who had been born into the shadow of one stabbing and had spent 40 years building a life in that shadow, had been stabbed to death in her bedroom in Denver, Colorado. Susan told media outlets that she was too upset to comment, that she was grieving and needed time. That is the most understandable sentence I have ever read in a true crime case file. Ariana's sister Rami set up a GoFundMe to bring Ariana's body back to California, to bring her home. She also established a separate fund to create a trust for Ariana's young son, the boy who had been with other family members on the night of July 3rd, the boy who would grow up without his mother, who would one day be old enough to understand what happened and would have to find a way to carry that understanding the way her grandmother, Susan, had carried hers. The link to that fund is in the description below this video. I am including it because Ariana's family asked for it to be shared, and because that boy deserves every resource his community can offer. I have been thinking about what to say in this section since I started researching this case, because the instinct, the easy instinct, is to focus on the Manson connection, to frame this story as a generational curse, a dark symmetry, a true crime coincidence so extraordinary that it almost defies belief. And it is extraordinary. It is genuinely one of the most striking biographical parallels I have encountered in any case I have researched. Rosemary LaBianca, Ariana Woke, grandmother and granddaughter, 50 years apart, both stabbed to death in their homes, Rosemary at 38, Ariana at 40, the same family, the same end. But I do not think the Manson connection is the most important thing about this case. The most important thing about this case is Ariana, not her grandmother's murder, not Charles Manson, not the dark symmetry of the dates and the method and the family line. Ariana, a woman who loved her son, who kept her door open, who helped people who had nowhere to go because her instinct towards generosity was stronger than her instinct towards self-protection, who was fighting a battle with addiction with the help of people who cared about her, who had plans on July 3rd, a barbecue, a park, a summer afternoon, and who made one decision on her way to a Walgreens that she could not have known would be her last. She was not defined by what happened to her grandmother. She was not a footnote in the Manson story. She was not a tragic echo of 1969. She was 40 years old, and she was in the middle of her life, and she deserved to finish it. Jose Sandoval Romero will not see freedom until he is in his mid-80s, if he sees it at all. That is the justice the legal system delivered. It is the correct outcome, and it does not give Susan her daughter back. It does not give Ariana's son his mother back. It does not close the wound that the LaBianca family has been living with since 1969, a wound that in 2020, just when it might have been approaching something like a scar, was torn open again. Before I go, if this documentary reached you and something about Ariana's story stayed with you the way it has with me, please share it. Not for the numbers, because Ariana Woke deserves to be known as more than a true crime footnote, because her son deserves to grow up in a world that knows her mother's name and knows that what happened to her was not the most important thing about her. Subscribe if you are not already here. Hit the bell. This channel is not done telling these stories.
Her name was Ariana Woke. She was 40 years old. She had a son she was raising alone. She had a laugh that people remembered. She had a generosity towards strangers that was one of her finest qualities and that the world should have protected rather than exploited. She was the granddaughter of a woman who was taken violently 50 years before her. She spent 40 years building a life in the shadow of that history. She deserved 50 more years to keep building it. Her mother, Susan, is still here, still grieving, carrying now what no parent should ever be asked to carry. Her son is still here, growing up, becoming whoever he is going to become, in the care of people who love him, in the knowledge that his mother loved him completely. Her name was Ariana Woke, and she deserved so much more time. Thank you for watching. I am Chloe, and I will see you in the next one.